The dust kicked up around Eleanor Hartwell's boots as she stood on the cracked earth, squinting against the brutal Arizona sun while everyone back in Prescott called her a fool for even considering this God-forsaken stretch of land in the summer of 1882. She held the surveying equipment steady, sweat trickling down her spine beneath her practical cotton dress, and marked another measurement in her leather-bound notebook with hands that refused to tremble despite the whispers that followed her everywhere she went. Her father had been a surveyor before consumption took him 2 years ago, and Eleanor had learned everything at his side from the time she could walk. She was 23 now, unmarried by choice rather than circumstance, and possessed of a vision that made the good people of Prescott shake their heads in pity or disdain depending on their temperament. This land, 3,000 acres of what appeared to be nothing but rocks and scrub brush and disappointment, called to her in a way she could not explain to anyone who asked. The heat shimmered off the ground in waves, distorting the horizon into something that looked like water but was only cruel illusion. Eleanor wiped her brow with the back of her hand and adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, studying the geological formations that rose up from the earth like the bones of some ancient creature. She had spent weeks poring over mining reports and geological surveys in the Territorial Library, cross-referencing water tables and mineral deposits, and what she had found made her heart race with possibility. Everyone said the land was worthless because the previous owner had tried to run cattle and failed miserably. The sparse grass could not support livestock, the water sources seemed non-existent, and the rocky terrain made farming impossible. But Eleanor was not looking at the land through the eyes of a rancher or a farmer. She saw the telltale signs of copper deposits in the exposed rock faces, noticed the way certain vegetation clustered in patterns that suggested underground water flows, and understood that sometimes worth was hidden beneath the surface where casual observers never thought to look. She was crouched over her transit, adjusting the leveling screws when she heard the sound of hooves approaching. Eleanor did not look up immediately, finishing her measurement before she acknowledged the visitor. Living as a woman alone in the Arizona Territory required a certain careful balance between caution and confidence, and she had learned to project the latter even when the former threatened to overwhelm her. "That is a lot of equipment for land that will not grow anything worth harvesting," a male voice said, rich with amusement rather than mockery. Eleanor straightened and turned, shading her eyes to look at the man on horseback. He sat easy in the saddle, a working cowboy by the look of him, with dust on his clothes and the kind of tan that came from years under the sun rather than days. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of good whiskey that studied her with frank curiosity. "Then it is fortunate I am not planning to harvest crops," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice level and professional. She had dealt with enough men who thought her work was either adorable or offensive to have developed a thick skin, but something about this stranger's tone suggested he was genuinely interested rather than dismissive. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse closer but stopping at a respectful distance. "Name is James Cordell," he said, touching the brim of his hat in greeting. "I work for the Triple Bar Ranch about 10 miles east of here. Saw you out here yesterday and the day before, and my curiosity got the better of my manners. What exactly are you surveying for, if you do not mind my asking?" Eleanor hesitated, weighing the risks of honesty against the benefits of discretion. But there was something about James Cordell's open expression, the way he looked at her equipment with interest rather than condescension, that made her decide to take a chance. "I am Eleanor Hartwell," she said, offering her hand in the forthright manner that scandalized the ladies back in Prescott. James took it without hesitation, his grip firm but not crushing. "I am surveying the land for mineral deposits and water sources." "Everyone sees worthless desert, but I see potential." James's eyes sharpened with interest. "Copper?" he asked, and Eleanor felt her estimation of him rise considerably. Most people would have guessed gold or silver, the flashy minerals that drew prospectors like moths to flame. Among other things, Eleanor confirmed. The geological indicators are promising, and there is water here, deeper than most people would think to drill, but accessible with the right equipment and knowledge. James walked a few paces away, studying the landscape with new attention. Eleanor watched him, noting the way he moved with the confidence of someone who knew the land, who had spent years reading weather and terrain and understanding the subtle language of the desert. When he turned back to her, his expression was thoughtful. "I have been riding this territory for 5 years," James said slowly. "Working cattle mostly, but paying attention to the land itself. You are right about the water. There are places where the rock formations suggest underground rivers. And I have seen rocks shot through with green that I now realize might be copper veining." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken. "You have seen the green veining. Can you show me where?" Over the next hour, James led Eleanor to 3 different locations on the property, pointing out geological features she had not yet discovered in her survey. He had a natural eye for the land, an intuitive understanding that complemented her technical knowledge in ways that surprised them both. They talked as they walked, comparing observations and theories, and Eleanor found herself relaxing in a way she rarely did around men who were not family. "Why are you working as a cowboy if you understand the land this well?" Eleanor asked as they stood on a rise overlooking the property, the sun beginning its descent toward the western mountains. James was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. "My father was a prospector," he said finally. "Spent his whole life chasing the next big strike, moving us from camp to camp, never settling anywhere long enough to build something lasting. I swore I would be different, that I would find steady work and save my money rather than gambling everything on dreams. But lately, I have been wondering if maybe I swung too far in the other direction, if maybe there is a middle ground between reckless dreaming and playing it safe." Eleanor understood that kind of conflict, the tension between honoring family legacy and forging your own path. "My father taught me everything about surveying," she said. "But he also taught me that the best opportunities come from seeing what others miss. This land is not worthless, it is misunderstood." "How much do they want for it?" James asked, turning to look at her directly. 3,000 acres at $2 an acre, Eleanor said. $6,000, which I do not have. I have been trying to interest investors in Prescott, but no one will listen to a woman talking about geological surveys and mineral rights. They pat my hand and tell me I should find a husband to take care of such complicated matters. James made a sound of disgust. "Fools," he said bluntly. "You know this land better than any man I have ever met. You have the knowledge and the vision. All you need is the capital." "An insurmountable problem," Eleanor said, trying to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I have some money saved, perhaps $1,000 from my father's estate, but it is nowhere near enough." James was quiet again, but this time Eleanor could see something working behind his eyes, calculation and possibility and decision all warring together. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of desert wind and the distant cry of a hawk. "I have money saved," James said finally, his voice careful. 5 years of cowboy wages with nowhere to spend them. I have been looking for something worth investing in, something that could be more than just punching cattle for another man's brand. What if we became partners? Eleanor stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would invest in land sight unseen based on one afternoon's conversation?" "Not sight unseen," James corrected. "I have been riding this land for years." "And not based on one conversation, but on watching you work for the past 3 days, seeing the thoroughness of your survey and understanding that you know what you are talking about. I have enough money to buy the land outright if we pool our resources, and you have the expertise to make it profitable. Seems like a partnership that could benefit us both." Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities and complications. "I do not even know you," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they were not quite true. She had learned more about James Cordell in one afternoon than she knew about men she had been acquainted with for years. "Then we should get to know each other," James said practically. "I am not suggesting we rush into anything, but I am serious about the partnership, about investing in this land. If you are willing, we could draw up proper legal papers, make it official. Equal partners in whatever we build here." The sun was setting in earnest now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple that seemed to set the desert on fire. Eleanor looked out over the land she had been studying for weeks, seeing it transformed by the light into something almost magical. She thought about her father, about the way he had taught her to trust her instincts and her training, to believe in her own observations even when others doubted. "I would want everything in writing," Eleanor said slowly. "Proper legal partnership papers drawn up by a lawyer, specifying equal ownership and equal say in all decisions regarding the land." "Agreed," James said immediately. "And I would want you to continue the survey, to map out exactly what we are working with before we make any decisions about development. No sense rushing in blind." Eleanor turned to face him fully, studying his face in the fading light. James met her gaze steadily, and she saw nothing but sincerity and excitement and the same kind of passionate belief in possibility that she felt burning in her own chest. "Then I suppose we have a partnership, Mr. Cordell," Eleanor said, extending her hand once more. "James," he said, taking her hand and shaking it firmly. "If we are going to be partners, we should at least be on a first-name basis, Eleanor." The sound of her name in his voice did something strange to her heartbeat, but Eleanor pushed the feeling aside. This was a business partnership, nothing more. The fact that James Cordell had kind eyes and capable hands and had listened to her ideas with respect rather than condescension was irrelevant to their professional relationship. Over the following weeks, Eleanor and James worked together to finalize the land purchase and establish their partnership. The lawyer in Prescott raised his eyebrows at the arrangement but drew up the papers as requested, creating a legal entity that gave them equal ownership and responsibility. The gossip in town reached fever pitch when word got out that Eleanor Hartwell had gone into business with a cowboy she barely knew. But Eleanor had long ago stopped caring what the gossiping tongues said about her. James proved to be a tireless worker and a quick learner. He resigned his position with the Triple Bar Ranch and threw himself into helping with the survey. Eleanor taught him the technical aspects of the work, showing him how to use the transit and the measuring chains, explaining the mathematics behind the calculations. James absorbed everything like a sponge, asking intelligent questions and making observations that often opened up new avenues of investigation. They established a camp on the property, sleeping in separate tents with a careful propriety that Eleanor appreciated. Whatever else James might be, he was a gentleman who understood the delicate nature of their situation. Working together from dawn until dusk, they mapped every inch of the 3,000 acres, marking water sources and mineral deposits and planning out how they might develop the land. It was during these long days of work that Eleanor began to know James Cordell as more than just a business partner. She learned that he had grown up in mining camps across California and Nevada, that his mother had died when he was 12 and his father when he was 20, leaving him alone in the world with nothing but his horse and his determination to build something different. She learned that he could read and write well, that he had taught himself from newspapers and borrowed books, and that he had a dry sense of humor that could make her laugh even when the work was frustrating. James, in turn, learned about Eleanor's childhood following her father on survey jobs, about the way her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn son when Eleanor was 15, about the years she had spent caring for her father as consumption slowly stole his strength. He learned about her love of mathematics and geology, her frustration with a society that could not see past her gender to her abilities, and her fierce determination to prove that she could succeed on her own terms. One evening in late July, as they sat by the campfire reviewing the day's measurements, James looked up from the notebook and said, "We have enough data now to start approaching mining companies about copper extraction rights. The deposits are substantial enough to be commercially viable." Eleanor nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. "I have been thinking about something more," she said slowly. "The copper deposits are valuable, certainly, but I believe we could do something more ambitious here. If we can tap into the deeper water sources, we could create a sustainable operation. Dig wells, establish a small settlement, bring in workers. We could control the entire operation rather than just selling off mineral rights and walking away." James set down the notebook, his full attention on her. "That would require significantly more capital than we have. We used most of our combined resources just to buy the land." "I know," Eleanor said, "but I have been thinking about it from every angle. If we can prove the water and mineral resources exist, we could take on limited partners or secure loans from banks in Phoenix or even San Francisco. We would retain majority control but bring in enough capital to actually develop the land properly." The firelight played across James's features as he considered her words. Eleanor waited, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. This was the biggest gamble of all, the difference between a safe, modest profit and something that could either make their fortune or bankrupt them entirely. "You really see it, don't you?" James said finally. "Not just the land as it is, but what it could become." "I do," Eleanor confirmed. "I see a town here, James. Small at first, just the workers and their families, but growing. I see copper mines and smelting operations, farms irrigated by well water, businesses serving the community. Everyone said this land was worthless because they only looked at the surface, but we know better." James stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out into the darkness where their land stretched away in all directions. When he turned back, his expression was resolved. "Then we do it properly. We drill a test well to prove the water source, take core samples from the most promising mineral deposits, and put together a proposal that no banker could refuse. It will take months of additional work, but if you believe in it, then so do I." Eleanor felt something warm and bright unfurl in her chest, and it took her a moment to recognize it as joy. "You trust my judgment that much. I trust you that much," James said simply. "You have not been wrong about anything yet, Eleanor. Your surveys are meticulous, your calculations are sound, and your vision is clear. Why would I doubt you now?" No man had ever spoken to her with such unquestioning confidence in her abilities. Eleanor stood and crossed to where James was standing, suddenly needing him to understand what his faith meant to her. "My father was the only person who ever believed in me the way you do. Everyone else either thinks I should give up these foolish notions and get married, or they humor me like I am a child playing at adult work, but you treat me like an equal." "Because you are my equal," James said, his voice rough. "More than equal in many ways. You have knowledge and skills that I am only beginning to understand. This partnership only works because we both bring something essential to it." They stood close together in the firelight, and Eleanor became suddenly aware of how alone they were, how improper their living arrangement must seem to anyone in Prescott. But she could not bring herself to care. For the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged, doing work that mattered with a partner who saw her as she truly was. "We should get some sleep," Eleanor said, stepping back before she could do something foolish. "Tomorrow we start planning the test well." Over the next 2 months, Eleanor and James threw themselves into the work with renewed purpose. They hired a drilling crew from Prescott, enduring the knowing looks and crude jokes about their partnership, and began drilling in the location Eleanor had identified as most promising. The work was slow and expensive, eating through their small reserve of capital, but Eleanor's calculations proved accurate. At 140 feet, they struck water, a strong flow that came up clean and cold. The drilling crew chief, a weathered man named Tom Murphy, whistled low when he saw the flow rate. "That is a better water source than half the established ranches in this territory," he said admiringly. "You have got good instincts, Miss Hartwell." Eleanor smiled but did not correct him that instincts had nothing to do with it. She had studied the geological surveys, mapped the water table, and calculated the most likely location for an aquifer. It was science and mathematics and careful observation, but she had learned that sometimes it was easier to let men attribute her success to luck or instinct rather than skill. James, however, knew better. As the drilling crew packed up their equipment, he pulled Eleanor aside, his face alight with excitement. "You did it. You proved the water exists just where you said it would. Do you understand what this means?" "It means we can move forward with the development plans," Eleanor said, trying to match his enthusiasm but feeling suddenly exhausted. The past weeks of anxiety about whether the well would produce, whether her calculations had been accurate, whether they would lose everything on a failed gamble, suddenly caught up with her. James must have seen something in her face because his expression softened. "Hey," he said gently, reaching out as if to touch her arm but stopping himself. "You have been carrying the weight of this whole operation on your shoulders. The water is here. You were right. Take a moment to let yourself feel that." Eleanor looked up at him, this cowboy who had believed in her vision enough to risk everything he had, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was more than gratitude, more than professional respect. Somewhere in the past months of working side by side, of sharing meals and conversations and dreams under the desert stars, James Cordell had become essential to her in ways that had nothing to do with their business partnership. "I could not have done this without you," Eleanor said quietly. "The money was important, yes, but it was more than that. You believed in me when I had almost stopped believing in myself." "That is not possible," James said with conviction. "You are the strongest, most determined person I have ever met. You would have found a way to make this happen with or without me. I am just grateful you let me be part of it." They stood there in the afternoon heat, the sound of water flowing from their well providing a musical counterpoint to their silence. Eleanor knew she should step away, should maintain the professional distance that had kept their partnership from becoming complicated by feelings neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. But she found herself swaying slightly toward James, drawn by something stronger than propriety or caution. James cleared his throat and took a deliberate step back, and Eleanor felt the loss of his proximity like a physical thing. "We should head into Prescott," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Use these results to start putting together the development proposal. The sooner we can present it to potential investors, the sooner we can move forward." Eleanor nodded, pushing down the confusing swirl of emotions that James's retreat had triggered. He was right, of course. They had work to do, a business to build. Personal feelings, whatever they might be, would only complicate matters. The trip to Prescott took most of the following day. They loaded up their wagon with all the survey results, water test data, and core samples from the mineral deposits, along with Eleanor's carefully drawn maps and development plans. The town was busy when they arrived, the streets crowded with miners and merchants, cowboys and gamblers, all the rough characters that made up Arizona territory in the 1880s. Eleanor was accustomed to the stares that followed her when she walked through town, the whispers about the peculiar Hartwell girl who refused to behave like a proper lady. But today, the stares seemed more pronounced, the whispers more pointed. She tried to ignore them, focusing instead on the task ahead as she and James made their way to the bank. Samuel Richardson, the bank manager, was a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers and a perpetual expression of disapproval. He listened to their proposal with increasing skepticism, examining the survey results and water test data with the air of someone humoring children. "Miss Hartwell, Mr. Cordell," he said when they had finished their presentation, "I appreciate the thoroughness of your work, but I am afraid the bank cannot extend credit for such a speculative venture." The land in question has a history of failure, and while your water well is certainly promising, it does not change the fundamental challenges of developing such a remote property. The challenges are precisely why the land was available at a price we could afford, Eleanor argued, leaning forward in her chair. And our survey proves that the resources are there. Copper deposits, water, everything needed to establish a viable operation. All we need is capital for equipment and initial labor costs. Richardson shook his head, his jowls wobbling with the motion. What you need, Miss Hartwell, is a husband to manage these affairs for you. A young woman has no business trying to develop mining operations in the desert. It is dangerous work, unsuitable for your sex. Eleanor felt her temper flare, but before she could respond, James spoke up, his voice deceptively mild. Mr. Richardson, with all due respect, Miss Hartwell's sex has nothing to do with her ability to survey land or develop resources. She has more geological knowledge than any man in this territory, myself included. If you are refusing to extend credit based on her gender rather than the merits of the proposal, perhaps we should take our business to a bank in Phoenix that understands the value of expertise regardless of who possesses it. Richardson's face flushed red. Now see here, young man, I will not be lectured about banking practices by a cowboy who barely has 2 pennies to rub together. If you want to waste your money following this young woman's fancies, that is your business, but the bank will not be party to such foolishness. They left the bank in tense silence, Eleanor's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had expected resistance, but the casual dismissal of months of careful work still stung. James walked beside her, his jaw tight with anger on her behalf, and that somehow made it worse. She did not want to be someone who needed defending. "We will try the bank in Phoenix," James said as they reached their wagon. "Or San Francisco if necessary. Someone will see the value in what we are proposing." Eleanor climbed onto the wagon seat, her mind already working through alternatives and contingencies. "We do not have the capital to waste on trips to banks that may or may not listen to us. We need a different approach. What are you thinking?" James asked, settling beside her and taking up the reins. "There are mining companies already operating in the territory," Eleanor said slowly. "What if instead of trying to secure loans for independent development, we approach them about a partnership? They have the capital and equipment, we have the land and the geological data. We negotiate terms that let us retain significant ownership while they provide the resources for development." James considered this as he guided the wagon through the crowded streets. It is riskier in some ways. We would be giving up sole control of the operation. But we would actually be able to move forward rather than spending months or years trying to convince banks to take us seriously, Eleanor countered. And if we negotiate carefully, we can maintain enough control to ensure the operation develops according to our vision. They spent the evening in the boarding house, where Eleanor maintained a room, spreading out their documents and discussing strategy. It was not entirely proper for James to be in her room, even with the door left open, but Eleanor was long past caring about such conventions. They worked late into the night, identifying potential mining companies to approach and refining their proposal. Somewhere around midnight, Eleanor looked up from the document she was reviewing to find James watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I was just thinking about how remarkable you are," James said quietly. "Most people would have given up after that meeting with Richardson, or at least been discouraged. But you immediately started looking for another way forward. You do not let anything stop you." Eleanor set down her papers, unsettled by the warmth in James's voice. "I cannot afford to give up. This land, this project, it is everything I have worked toward. My father always said that the difference between success and failure was often just persistence." "It is more than persistence," James said, leaning back in his chair. "It is vision and courage and intelligence. You see possibilities that no one else sees, and you have the skill to make them real." "With your help," Eleanor reminded him. I could not do this alone, James. Your investment made it possible, but it is more than the money. You understand the land in ways I do not. You see things I miss. We make a good team. We do, James agreed, and something in his tone made Eleanor's breath catch. The room suddenly felt smaller, the late hour more intimate. They were alone together in the lamplight, partners who had become something more without either of them quite acknowledging it. Eleanor stood abruptly, breaking the moment. We should get some rest. Tomorrow we start contacting mining companies and we will need clear heads for the negotiations. James rose as well, gathering his hat and jacket. He paused at the door, turning back to look at her. Eleanor, I want you to know that whatever happens with the land, whatever we build or do not build, being your partner has been the best decision I ever made. Not because of the business, but because of you. Before Eleanor could find words to respond, James was gone, his footsteps echoing down the hallway of the boarding house. She stood frozen in the middle of her room, her heart pounding, wondering what exactly had just happened and what it meant for their partnership going forward. Sleep did not come easily that night. Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and replaying the evening's conversation. She had spent years building walls around herself, protecting her heart from the kind of vulnerability that came with caring too deeply for another person. Her work had been enough, her dreams of building something meaningful had filled the empty spaces. But James Cordell had somehow slipped past her defenses, becoming essential in ways that terrified her. The next morning, they set out early to visit the offices of Copper Canyon Mining Company, one of the larger operations in the territory. Eleanor had chosen them carefully, researching their reputation and their willingness to take on new ventures. The company was owned by a man named Richard Thornton, a transplant from Pennsylvania who had made his fortune in coal before moving west to the more lucrative copper trade. Thornton received them in his office, a surprisingly refined space above a general store in Prescott. He was perhaps 50, with steel-gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Unlike Richardson, Thornton actually examined their survey results with genuine interest, asking detailed questions about Eleanor's methodology and the quality of the mineral samples. "This is impressive work," Thornton said finally, setting down the last of the documents. "Your geological analysis is as thorough as any I have seen from professional mining engineers. Where did you study, Miss Hartwell?" "I did not study formally," Eleanor admitted. "My father was a surveyor, and I learned from him. But I have read everything I could find on geology and mineralogy, and I have years of practical experience in the field." Thornton nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes practical experience is worth more than formal education. I started as a miner myself before I became an owner." He turned his attention to James. "And you, Mr. Cordell, what is your role in this partnership?" "I provided the capital to purchase the land," James said, "but more than that, I know the territory. I can read the land, understand weather patterns and water sources. Eleanor has the technical knowledge, I have the practical experience of living and working in the desert. Together we make a complete team." Eleanor felt a flush of warmth at how naturally James positioned them as equals, neither diminishing his contributions nor trying to claim credit for hers. It was exactly the kind of partnership she had always hoped for but never expected to find. Thornton leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Here is what I am prepared to offer. Copper Canyon Mining will provide all equipment, labor, and operational capital for developing the copper deposits. In exchange, we take 60% ownership of the mining operation. You retain 40% and maintain advisory roles in the development process. Additionally, any water rights and non-mineral uses of the land remain entirely under your control." Eleanor and James exchanged glances. It was a better offer than Eleanor had dared hope for, but she had learned from her father never to accept a first offer without negotiation. 55% for Copper Canyon, 45% for us, Eleanor countered. "And we want contractual guarantees about sustainable mining practices and treatment of workers." This land represents our entire investment, Mr. Thornton. We need assurances that it will be developed responsibly. Thornton smiled, an expression that suggested he had expected no less. 55% it is, and I am happy to include provisions about mining practices. In fact, I would insist on them regardless. Sustainable operations are good business in the long term. He stood and extended his hand first to Eleanor, then to James. I believe we have the foundation of a partnership, pending review by our respective lawyers. Over the next weeks, the partnership agreement was formalized with painstaking attention to detail. Eleanor insisted on provisions protecting the workers who would be employed in the mine, ensuring fair wages and safe conditions, clauses that Thornton accepted more readily than she had expected. The contract gave Copper Canyon control of mining operations while preserving Eleanor and James's authority over land use, water rights, and long-term development planning. With the contract signed and financing secured, work began in earnest. Thornton brought in mining engineers and equipment, while Eleanor and James oversaw the establishment of infrastructure. They drilled additional wells, laid out roads, and began planning the workers' settlement that would support the mining operation. It was exhausting, exhilarating work that demanded 16-hour days and every ounce of energy they possessed. Eleanor and James worked side by side through the scorching summer and into the cooler autumn months, their partnership evolving into something so seamless that they often anticipated each other's needs without speaking. But beneath the professional collaboration, unspoken feelings continued to simmer. Eleanor caught herself watching James when she thought he was not looking, noticing the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders when he lifted heavy equipment, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentleness of his hands when he helped her down from the wagon. And sometimes she caught James watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch and her heart race. They never spoke of it. The work was too important, the partnership too valuable to risk on something as uncertain as romance. But the awareness hung between them like summer lightning, crackling with potential. One evening in October, as they stood on the rise overlooking what was rapidly becoming a bustling worksite, James broke the careful silence they had maintained. "Eleanor, we need to talk about what is happening between us." Eleanor's first instinct was to pretend ignorance, to deflect and avoid, but she respected James too much for dishonesty. "I know," she said quietly. "I have been feeling it too." "I am trying to be professional," James said, frustration evident in his voice. "I am trying to focus on the work and not think about how much I want to take your hand, or how I look for excuses to be near you, or how every time you smile at me I forget what I was supposed to be doing." Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. "James, let me finish," he said, turning to face her fully. "I know this complicates everything. We are business partners, and mixing romance with business is a recipe for disaster. But I cannot keep pretending that what I feel for you is purely professional respect. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, Eleanor Hartwell, and somewhere between surveying rocks and drilling wells, I fell completely in love with you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Eleanor stared at James, his words ringing in her ears, feeling like her carefully constructed walls were crumbling. "We barely know each other," she said weakly. "It has only been a few months." "I know that you wake up before dawn and make terrible coffee," James said with a slight smile. "I know that you hum when you are doing calculations, and that you have memorized entire chapters of geology textbooks, and that you care more about treating workers fairly than maximizing profits. I know that you are brave and brilliant and stubborn and kind. What else do I need to know?" Eleanor felt tears pricking at her eyes, a vulnerability she rarely allowed herself. "I am afraid," she admitted. "Everything I have worked for is finally coming together. The land is being developed, the mining operation is starting, we are building something real and lasting. What if we ruin it by trying to be more than partners?" James reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand in his. His palm was rough from work, warm and solid and real. "What if we ruin it by pretending we do not feel this way?" he countered. "Eleanor, I am not going anywhere regardless of what happens between us romantically. I am committed to this partnership, to this land, to building what we have planned. But I am also committed to being honest with you, and the honest truth is that I love you. You do not have to love me back, and it will not change our working relationship if you do not. But I needed you to know." Eleanor looked down at their joined hands, feeling the weight of the decision before her. She had spent so long protecting herself, keeping people at a safe distance where they could not hurt her. But James was asking her to be brave in a different way, to risk her heart the same way she had risked everything else on this venture. "I do love you," she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. "I have been trying not to, trying to convince myself it was just gratitude or professional respect, but I love you, James. I love your kindness and your integrity and the way you believe in me even when I doubt myself. I love how you understand the land and how you treat everyone with respect regardless of their station. I love you, and it scares me to death." James's face transformed, joy breaking across his features like sunrise. He raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Then we will be scared together," he said. "And we will figure it out as we go, the same way we have figured out everything else." Eleanor felt something loosen in her chest, years of self-imposed isolation and fear releasing their grip. She stepped closer to James, and he wrapped his arms around her carefully, as if she were something precious that might break. She rested her head against his chest, hearing the steady beat of his heart, and let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have both the professional success she had dreamed of and the personal happiness she had convinced herself was not meant for her. They stood there as the sun set over their land, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Two people who had found each other in the least likely of places and built something neither could have achieved alone. The mining operation officially began in November, with crews excavating the first copper deposits under Eleanor's careful supervision. She had designed the operation to be as efficient and safe as possible, incorporating ideas from the latest mining journals, and insisting on proper ventilation and structural support. The workers, initially skeptical of taking direction from a woman, quickly learned to respect Eleanor's expertise when her methods proved both effective and considerate of their safety. James took charge of the practical logistics, organizing supply chains and managing the day-to-day operations of the growing settlement. Workers began bringing their families, and what had been bare desert was rapidly transforming into a small community. They built simple houses, established a general store, and even started planning a schoolhouse for the children who were beginning to arrive. Eleanor and James's relationship evolved alongside the physical development of the land. They were careful to maintain professionalism during working hours, but in the evenings they would walk together through the settlement, talking about their dreams for what it could become. James began courting Eleanor properly, with a sweetness that made her heart ache, bringing her wildflowers from the desert and reading to her from newspapers when she was too exhausted to focus. One evening in December, as they sat outside Eleanor's cabin watching the stars emerge, James said, "I want to marry you, Eleanor." It was not quite a proposal, more a statement of intention, and Eleanor appreciated his directness. "I want that too," she said. "But I need you to understand what that would mean. I am not going to stop working, James. I am not going to hand over control of the operation or start staying home to keep house. I need a partner who can accept that I will always choose to be involved in the business." "I would not want you any other way," James assured her. "I fell in love with you precisely because of your passion and competence. Why would I want to change the things that make you who you are?" He paused, then added with a smile, "Though I confess I would not mind if you learned to make better coffee." Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and unguarded. "That is a fair criticism. My coffee is truly terrible." "So is that a yes?" James asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Will you marry me, Eleanor Hartwell? Will you let me be your husband as well as your business partner? Eleanor turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression the same vulnerability she felt in her own heart. Yes, she said simply. I will marry you, James Cordell. James pulled a ring from his pocket, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that caught the starlight. I know it is not much, he said as he slipped it onto her finger. But I wanted you to have something that was not about the land or the business, something that was just about us. Eleanor looked at the ring, feeling tears sting her eyes for the second time since knowing James. It is perfect, she said honestly. Everything about this is perfect. They were married in Prescott on a cold January morning in 1883, with only a handful of witnesses including Richard Thornton and Tom Murphy, the drilling crew chief. Eleanor wore a simple blue dress that she had made herself, and James wore his best suit, and they pledged themselves to each other in a ceremony that was brief and heartfelt. The return to their land felt like coming home. Eleanor had been worried that marriage might change the dynamic of their partnership, but if anything, it only strengthened it. They were united now not just by legal contract but by vows and love, and that foundation gave them confidence to dream even bigger. The mining operation flourished through the spring. The copper deposits proved even richer than Eleanor's initial surveys had suggested, and Thornton was pleased enough with the returns that he began discussing expansion. More workers arrived, and the settlement grew to nearly 200 people. Eleanor and James worked with the residents to establish a proper town, complete with elected officials and basic laws. In March, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. The discovery was both thrilling and terrifying, raising questions about how she would manage her work as her body changed. But James was supportive in ways that eased her fears, promising to take on more of the physical labor while ensuring Eleanor remained involved in all decisions. This changes nothing about who you are or what you are capable of, James told her firmly when she voiced her concerns. You will be a mother, yes, but you are also a businesswoman and a surveyor and my partner. All of those things can coexist. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and into the summer. She adapted her work to her changing body, spending more time on planning and supervision and less on physical surveying, but she remained deeply involved in every aspect of the operation. The workers had long since accepted her authority, and many of the wives sought her out for advice and leadership as the community developed. In July, as Eleanor's due date approached, James became increasingly protective and worried. What if something goes wrong? He asked one evening as they sat in their cabin, Eleanor's hand resting on her swollen belly. The nearest doctor is in Prescott, more than a day's ride away. Women have been having babies in remote locations since the beginning of time, Eleanor reminded him gently. And Martha Grayson has delivered more babies than most doctors. She has agreed to attend the birth, and everything will be fine. But Eleanor's confidence wavered when labor began on a sweltering August afternoon. The pain was worse than she had anticipated, and the hours stretched on with frightening intensity. James stayed by her side despite Martha's suggestion that he wait outside, holding Eleanor's hand and whispering encouragement even as his face went pale with worry. Their son was born just before dawn, entering the world with a powerful cry that seemed to echo across the desert. Eleanor held him for the first time, this tiny perfect person that she and James had created, and felt overwhelmed by a love different from anything she had experienced before. He is beautiful, James said, his voice thick with emotion. You are amazing, Eleanor, I love you so much. They named him Daniel Thomas Cordell after both their fathers, and he became the heart of their household. Eleanor discovered that motherhood was every bit as challenging and rewarding as building a business, requiring different skills but equal dedication. She learned to balance caring for Daniel with continuing her work, often bringing him with her to the work sites in a sling James fashioned from soft leather. The mining operation continued to thrive, and with its success came new opportunities and challenges. In the fall of 1883, a railroad company approached them about extending a spur line to their settlement, which they had named Hartwell Springs after Eleanor's father. The railroad would make shipping copper ore dramatically more efficient, but it would also open their small community to rapid growth and change. Eleanor and James spent weeks debating the decision, weighing the economic benefits against the potential loss of the tight-knit community they had worked to build. In the end, they agreed to the railroad extension but negotiated terms that gave them significant input on how development would proceed. "We started this to build something sustainable," Eleanor argued during one of their planning sessions. "Not to create a boom town that will collapse when the copper runs out. If we are going to allow the railroad, we need to ensure the town can survive beyond the mining operation." They implemented this vision by encouraging diversification. Using the water from their wells, they helped establish farms and orchards around the edges of the settlement. They brought in craftsmen and merchants, teachers and preachers, building the infrastructure of a real town rather than just a mining camp. It was slow, painstaking work, but Eleanor and James were patient, willing to sacrifice quick profits for long-term stability. As Daniel grew from infant to toddler, Eleanor marveled at how full her life had become. She had the work she loved, the partnership she valued, and a family that grounded her in ways she had not expected. James was a devoted father, often taking Daniel with him on his rounds through the settlement, teaching their son about the land the same way Eleanor's father had taught her. In the spring of 1885, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time she was less anxious, confident in her ability to balance motherhood and work. Their daughter was born in October, a tiny, fierce creature they named Catherine Grace after James's mother. Where Daniel was serious and observant like Eleanor, Catherine was all energy and mischief, keeping them constantly on their toes. Hartwell Springs continued to grow, the population reaching nearly 800 by 1886. The railroad spur was completed, and copper ore began shipping to smelters in larger cities. The town now had proper streets, a school with 2 teachers, 3 churches, a doctor, and a thriving business district. It was far beyond what Eleanor had imagined that day she had stood on barren desert measuring worthless land. But success brought new complications. As Hartwell Springs grew more prosperous, it attracted the attention of less savory elements. Gamblers and confidence men arrived, along with the usual collection of outlaws that plagued frontier towns. James, who had been informally serving as the settlement's peacekeeper, was elected town marshal, a development that worried Eleanor deeply. "I do not want you putting yourself in danger," she told him the night after the election. "We have children now, James, responsibilities beyond just ourselves." "Which is exactly why someone needs to keep order," James replied. "I know this town and these people. I can do this job, Eleanor, and do it fairly. Trust me." Eleanor did trust him, but that did not make it easier to watch him pin on the marshal's badge and begin carrying a gun. The Arizona Territory was still wild, still dangerous, and she lived with constant awareness that the life they had built could be shattered by violence. Her fears proved justified on a cold November morning when a dispute over a mining claim escalated into gunfire. James was shot trying to break up the confrontation, a bullet that struck his shoulder and knocked him unconscious. Eleanor heard the news while working at the mine office, and she ran through the streets with her heart in her throat, certain she was about to become a widow. But James survived, thanks to the town doctor's skill and his own stubborn constitution. Eleanor sat by his bedside for 3 days while fever threatened to take him, holding his hand and praying to a God she was not sure she believed in anymore. When he finally woke, weak but lucid, Eleanor broke down and wept with relief. "You are resigning as marshal," she told him, her voice shaking. "I do not care what the town needs or who else can do the job. I need you alive, James. Our children need their father." James did not argue. The shooting had scared him as much as it had scared Eleanor, showing him how quickly he could be taken from the family he loved. He resigned from the marshal position and returned his full attention to managing the town's development and their business interests. The incident created a shift in their relationship, making them both more aware of how precious and fragile their happiness was. They began making more time for their family, taking Sunday afternoons to ride out into the desert with the children, showing Daniel and Catherine the land that had brought their parents together. In 1887, Copper Canyon Mining proposed a major expansion that would dramatically increase production and profits. Eleanor and James had to carefully consider whether growth at that scale aligned with their vision for Hartwell Springs. After much discussion, they agreed to the expansion but used their advisory role to insist on stringent environmental protections and worker safety standards. "We could make a fortune if we cut corners," Richard Thornton pointed out during one contentious meeting. "But I suppose that is not what motivates you too." "Money matters," Eleanor said firmly, "but not at the expense of destroying the land or exploiting the people who work for us. We built Hartwell Springs to be sustainable, and that means protecting the resources that support it." Thornton shook his head with a smile. "You are terrible for my profit margins, Eleanor, but I suppose that is why this operation has been so successful. People want to work here because they know they will be treated fairly. That is worth something, even if it is harder to quantify." The expansion went forward with Eleanor and James's stipulations in place. Production increased, and so did the town's prosperity, but not at the cost of their principles. Hartwell Springs developed a reputation throughout the territory as a fair place to work, attracting skilled miners and craftsmen who might have gone elsewhere. In 1888, Eleanor returned to surveying in a serious way for the first time since Daniel's birth. The mining company wanted to explore potential deposits on adjacent land, and Eleanor's expertise was essential for determining whether expansion was viable. She spent weeks in the field with James by her side, leaving the children in the care of trusted friends, and rediscovered the joy of the work that had first defined her. "I miss this," she admitted to James one evening as they made camp under the stars. "I love being a mother and I love running the business side of things, but there is something about being out here, measuring and calculating and discovering what is hidden beneath the surface, that makes me feel most like myself." "Then we should make sure you get to do it more often," James said. "Catherine is 5 now, old enough to understand when we need to be away for work. And Daniel is fascinated by surveying. Maybe it is time to start teaching him the way your father taught you." The idea delighted Eleanor, and when they returned to Hartwell Springs, she began including Daniel in her surveying work. He proved to have inherited her mathematical aptitude and her love of the land, absorbing information with an intensity that reminded Eleanor of herself at that age. Catherine, meanwhile, showed more interest in the business side of things, often trailing after James and asking endless questions about managing operations. Time passed in the way it does when life is full and purposeful. The children grew, the town prospered, and Eleanor and James continued to build both their business and their family. In 1890, Eleanor gave birth to twin boys they named Andrew and Samuel, completing their family. The cabin they had built in the early days was now a proper house, expanded to accommodate their growing brood, with a parlor where Eleanor kept her surveying equipment, and a study where James managed the accounts. Hartwell Springs celebrated its 10th anniversary in 1892, and the town organized a celebration that drew people from across the territory. Eleanor stood on a platform with James, looking out at the crowd of nearly 1,500 people who now called the town home, and felt almost overwhelmed by what they had accomplished. 10 years ago, everyone said this land was worthless, Eleanor said in her speech. They said nothing could grow here, nothing could thrive. But they were wrong. Not because the land changed, but because we chose to see what was possible rather than accepting what appeared obvious. Hartwell Springs exists because people were willing to work hard, to trust in a vision, and to build something together. The crowd cheered, and Eleanor caught James's eye. He smiled at her with a warmth and pride that still, after all these years, made her heart flutter. They had built something remarkable together, not just a town or a business, but a life that encompassed love and work and family in equal measure. The mining operation continued successfully through the 1890s, though Eleanor and James began planning for an eventual transition away from copper as the primary economic driver. They invested in agricultural development, using innovative irrigation techniques to establish orchards and farms. They brought in craftsmen to establish workshops and small factories, diversifying the town's economy so it would not collapse when the copper deposits eventually played out. In 1895, Daniel was 16 and ready to attend university. Eleanor and James discussed sending him to the School of Mines in California, but Daniel surprised them by saying he wanted to stay in Hartwell Springs and continue learning the business from them. "Everything I need to know is right here," he argued. "You and Mother have built something incredible, and I want to be part of it. There will be time for formal education later if I need it, but right now I want to learn from the best teachers I could ask for." Eleanor felt torn between pride in her son's commitment and concern that he might be limiting his opportunities. But James pointed out that Daniel was old enough to make his own decisions, and that there was genuine value in the apprenticeship approach. Catherine, at 13, was already showing signs of the fierce independence that had defined Eleanor at that age. She spent her time equally between helping with the business accounts and riding out into the desert with her younger brothers, comfortable equally in the office and in the wilds. Watching her daughter grow into her own strength filled Eleanor with a satisfaction different from any business success. The twins, Andrew and Samuel, were 11 now, and while they looked identical, their personalities could not have been more different. Andrew was thoughtful and bookish, already showing an interest in law and government. Samuel was all action and energy, happiest when working with the mining crews or helping the ranch hands. In 1896, Richard Thornton announced his intention to retire and offered to sell Copper Canyon Mining's share of the Hartwell Springs operation back to Eleanor and James. It was a tremendous financial undertaking, but they had been successful enough over the years to make it possible. After careful consideration and long discussions with their now-adult children, they decided to purchase full ownership. The transaction was completed in early 1897, making Eleanor and James the sole owners of the mining operation they had started 15 years earlier. It was a vindication of everything Eleanor had believed about the land's potential, everything she had worked to prove when everyone said she was chasing worthless desert dreams. "We should celebrate," James said the day the papers were signed. "Take a trip, just the two of us, for the first time in years." They left the business in Daniel's capable hands and took a train to San Francisco, staying in a fine hotel and spending a week being tourists in the bustling city. It was strange and wonderful to be alone together, to remember that they were not just business partners and parents but husband and wife who still, after all these years, found joy in each other's company. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked one evening as they walked along the waterfront. "Giving up the security of regular cowboy wages to gamble on worthless land with a strange woman." James laughed and pulled her close. "Not for a single moment. You gave me everything I did not even know I wanted, a purpose, a family, a life worth living." "I was the one who got the better end of our bargain, Eleanor." "We both got exactly what we needed," Eleanor said, resting her head against his shoulder. "I could not have done any of it without you, James. Not the business, not the town, not this life. You saw my vision when no one else would, and you believed in me enough to risk everything. That is a gift I can never fully repay." They returned to Hartwell Springs refreshed and ready to tackle the next phase of development. With full ownership of the mining operation, They had the freedom to implement long-term planning that went beyond quarterly profits. They established a workers' profit-sharing program, created a fund for education and town improvements, and began seriously planning for the post-mining future of Hartwell Springs. The turn of the century found Eleanor and James in their early 40s, still deeply involved in managing the town, but also beginning to think about succession planning. Daniel had proven himself more than capable of running the mining operation, and Catherine was showing a brilliant aptitude for the business side. The twins were headed off to university, Andrew to study law and Samuel to study engineering. In 1901, the copper deposits that had fueled Hartwell Springs began to show signs of depletion. It was not unexpected. Eleanor's original surveys had predicted a roughly 20-year lifespan for the primary veins, and they had been producing for nearly 19 years. But knowing it was coming did not make the transition any less challenging. Eleanor and James called a town meeting to discuss the future honestly. "The copper that built this town is running out," Eleanor told the assembled residents. "But Hartwell Springs was always meant to be more than a mining camp. We have farms and orchards, workshops and businesses. We have a school and churches and a community. The mining operation supported us, but it does not define us." The transition was not seamless, but the diversification they had worked for years to establish paid off. Some families left to seek opportunities elsewhere, but most stayed, committed to the town they had helped build. The mining operation scaled down but did not close entirely, continuing to produce copper at a smaller rate while employing fewer workers. Eleanor shifted her focus to water management and agricultural development, using her surveying expertise to help establish more efficient irrigation systems. James worked with the town council to attract new businesses and industries, leveraging Hartwell Springs' reputation for fair dealing and skilled workers. In 1903, Daniel married a woman named Sarah Mitchell, a teacher who had come to Hartwell Springs 2 years earlier. Eleanor and James welcomed her into the family warmly, grateful that their son had found a partner who shared his values and vision. The wedding was a joyous affair that brought together the entire town, a celebration not just of Daniel and Sarah's union, but of the community they were all part of. Catherine, at 21, showed no signs of settling down, declaring that she was far too busy learning to run a business empire to worry about romance. Eleanor recognized her younger self in her daughter's fierce independence and knew better than to push. Love would come when Catherine was ready for it, if she ever was, and that was entirely her choice to make. The twins returned from university in 1904, Andrew with a law degree and Samuel with an engineering degree, both eager to contribute to Hartwell Springs in their own ways. Andrew established a law practice that served not just the town but the surrounding territory, quickly gaining a reputation for fairness and integrity. Samuel threw himself into improving the town's infrastructure, designing better roads and water systems. Eleanor found herself easing back from daily management, spending more time mentoring the next generation and pursuing her own interests in geology and surveying. She published several papers on southwestern geology and water management, work that gained her recognition in academic circles despite her lack of formal credentials. James, too, stepped back from the most demanding aspects of running the business, though he remained actively involved in town governance and community development. They took more time for themselves, for long rides into the desert where they had first fallen in love, for quiet evenings on their porch watching the sunset paint their land in shades of gold. In 1906, on the 24th anniversary of their first meeting, James took Eleanor back to the exact spot where she had been surveying when he first rode up and changed her life. The land looked different now, with roads and buildings visible in the distance, but the fundamental character of the desert remained unchanged. "I remember the first time I saw you," James said, taking Eleanor's hand. "Standing here with your surveying equipment so focused and determined. I thought you were the most fascinating woman I had ever seen. I thought you were an annoying cowboy who was interrupting my work, Eleanor said with a laugh. I had no idea you would become everything to me. We built a good life together, James said softly. Better than anything I imagined that day. You gave me purpose and love and family. You showed me what it means to see beyond the obvious, to believe in what could be rather than settling for what is. Every day with you has been a gift, Eleanor. Eleanor felt tears slip down her cheeks, not from sadness but from the overwhelming gratitude of a life well lived. I love you, James Cordell. I have loved you from the moment you chose to believe in my vision, and I will love you until my last breath. They stood there in the desert they had transformed together. Two people who had taken worthless land and built not just a town or a business, but a legacy of vision and partnership and love that would endure long after they were gone. The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of a life well established. Catherine surprised everyone in 1908 by falling in love with a geologist named Thomas Brennan, who had come to Hartwell Springs to study the depleted copper deposits. Eleanor watched her daughter's courtship with amusement and delight, seeing history echo as Catherine found a partner who understood and valued her intelligence and independence. Daniel and Sarah's family grew to include 3 children, giving Eleanor and James the joy of grandchildren to spoil. Andrew married a lawyer he met in Phoenix, a sharp woman named Margaret who became Andrew's perfect professional and personal partner. Samuel remained happily unmarried, declaring himself wedded to his engineering projects and seemingly content with that choice. In 1910, Hartwell Springs celebrated its 30th anniversary with festivities that lasted an entire week. The town now boasted a population of over 2,000, with an economy based on agriculture, light manufacturing, and its reputation as a good place to raise families. The original mining operation had been closed for 5 years, but the town thrived, exactly as Eleanor and James had planned. Eleanor was 51 now, her dark hair threaded with silver, her hands weathered from years of work. But her mind was as sharp as ever, and she continued to consult on surveying projects throughout the territory. James, at 54, had aged into a distinguished gravitas that made him a natural leader in territorial politics, though he steadfastly refused to run for any office that would take him away from Hartwell Springs for extended periods. We built this town together, he told Eleanor when supporters tried to convince him to run for territorial legislature. I am not interested in abandoning it for politics in Phoenix. Everything I care about is right here. In 1912, Arizona achieved statehood and Hartwell Springs celebrated along with the rest of the territory. Eleanor and James attended the festivities in Phoenix as honored guests, recognized for their contributions to Arizona's development. Standing together as the new state flag was raised, Eleanor reflected on the journey from that day in 1882, when she had been surveying worthless land alone in the desert. She had proven that vision and determination could transform not just land but lives. She had shown that a woman's expertise and intelligence deserved respect and recognition. She had built a business, a town, a family, and a partnership that stood as testimony to what was possible when people chose to believe in each other. The years grew gentler as Eleanor and James moved into their 60s. They handed over more responsibility to their children, who had proven themselves more than capable of carrying forward the legacy their parents had established. Eleanor spent her time writing, documenting the geological surveys and business strategies that had made Hartwell Springs possible, determined to leave a record for future generations. James devoted himself to community service and spending time with his growing brood of grandchildren. He taught them about the land with the same patience and wisdom he had brought to everything else, passing down the knowledge that had served him so well. In 1920, Eleanor published a comprehensive book on southwestern geology and sustainable land development that was adopted as a textbook by several universities. The recognition was gratifying, but more important to Eleanor was knowing that her life's work would continue to have impact long after she was gone. Catherine had taken over as primary manager of the family businesses, running them with efficiency and innovation that made her parents proud. Daniel focused on agricultural development, continuing to expand the farming operations that had replaced mining as the economic foundation of Hartwell Springs. Andrew served as the town's leading lawyer and occasional judge, while Samuel's engineering firm had expanded to work on projects throughout the state. As Eleanor and James entered their 70s, they settled into a peaceful routine of mornings on their porch, afternoons with grandchildren, and evenings reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared. They still took occasional rides out into the desert, though shorter now, still finding joy in the landscape that had brought them together. One evening in the spring of 1928, as they sat watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, James took Eleanor's hand and said, "It has been a remarkable life, has it not?" "Beyond anything I could have imagined," Eleanor agreed. "That day when you rode up and interrupted my surveying, I thought you were just another cowboy looking for amusement. I never dreamed you would become my everything." "I saw your vision," James said softly. "I saw you looking at worthless land and seeing possibility, and I knew I wanted to be part of whatever you were building. Best decision I ever made, buying all that land with you." "Best decision I ever made was letting you," Eleanor replied, squeezing his hand. "We built something wonderful together, James. Not just the town or the business, but this life, this family, this love. I would not change a single moment of it." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a legacy that would endure for generations. The land they had transformed stretched out around them, no longer worthless desert, but thriving testament to what vision and partnership could achieve. Eleanor Hartwell and James Cordell lived out their remaining years in Hartwell Springs, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and the community they had worked so hard to build. They died within months of each other in 1932. Their love story complete, but their legacy enduring in every corner of the town they had created from nothing but vision and determination and faith in each other. Hartwell Springs continued to prosper, growing into a small city that honored its founders with parks and schools and monuments bearing their names. But the greatest monument was the town itself, proof that worthless land could become priceless when seen through the eyes of someone brave enough to believe in possibility. And that true partnership, built on respect and love and shared vision, could move mountains and transform deserts into thriving communities that would endure for generations to come. The story of the woman surveying worthless land and the cowboy who saw her vision and bought it all became legend in Arizona, told and retold as an example of frontier ingenuity and romantic partnership. But for Eleanor and James, it had simply been their life, ordinary in its daily details and extraordinary in its accumulation of moments, each one building on the last until they had created something that would outlast them both and stand as testimony to what two people could accomplish when they chose to believe in each other and work together toward a shared dream. Their love story, set against the harsh beauty of the Arizona territory, proved that the greatest treasures are often found not in what appears valuable on the surface, but in what is revealed when you look deeper, when you trust your vision and find a partner willing to take the journey with you, and when you build something not just for yourself, but for generations yet to come.